Hi, my name is Matt Welch. I'm the editor-in-chief of Reason Magazine, the magazine for free minds and free markets. It's been around for 40 years. I'm here on Blogging Heads TV today with the executive editor of the American Prospect magazine, Mark Schmitt. Mark, hello.
Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm doing well.
This is a different office than my old familiar Blogging Heads habitat.
Oh, where are you coming out of right now?
Well, now I'm at the American Prospect. Before
okay.
I used to do these from my office at the New America Foundation, which is a lot messier than this office is.
Yeah, that's right. So you just became the editor in February or March of this year? How did that happen?
I became the editor. I became the editor about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, holy crap! Let's hear about who you had to kill.
And we've got an issue closing. We've got an issue closing in about 3 days, and I'm still taking the time for the Blogging Heads viewers.
That's I appreciate the commitment. Tell me a little bit, because I actually don't really know the answer to this question. How is the American Prospect different, or how is it positionally different than, say, the Washington Monthly or the Nation magazine? What's the different flavor of oxygen that you're blowing into the tent?
Okay, well, that's a great question. That's a great question. I think there used to be, I think there are a lot of things where there used to be all kinds of distinctions, from the center left to the left, which somehow have in certain ways been papered over. So that, for example, I've written a lot for the Washington Monthly, and I've written a lot for the American Prospect. And there's a lot of other overlaps. I've never written for the Nation, but it's not for lack of being willing to. I think you would characterize it, in its classic incarnation, the Washington Monthly was a little more, when in the 70s they used to, 80s, they used to call neoliberal, meaning different, not the current meaning of neoliberal, which is a little more economically libertarian, internationalist, but sort of a little bit more technocratic, a little bit kind of like the orientation of the think tank I used to work at, New America Foundation, of being
right.
A little bit beyond left and right. American Prospect, the traditional base has been a kind of a little more of labor-oriented left, a little more practical. Nation, varies a little more, sometimes a little further left. By being a weekly, it's kind of got a different culture, and by being in New York, it's kind of got a little less of a Washington tone. But people should read all of them, as they should read Reason.
Nicely put. What does it mean in the 21st century to be more labor-oriented? Do you wake up in the morning feeling that you're oriented towards labor?
No, I think it's a recognition that there's an important role for labor, that they're kind of matters of inequality and consequences of the current economic system that actually could be remedied quite readily if we had a system in which if we had the level of union density that we had in the 1950s and 1960s, and workers had the kind of bargaining power that they had at the time. That's just sort of a basic historical fact. Now, I've written a column in this magazine for a long time, and I wrote a column a few months ago, kind of making fun of the almost nostalgia for the 1950s that people sometimes had, and basically pointing out that we're not going to get to that level of union density, and there have to be other ways of dealing with that kind of inequality. But I think that there's an orientation to understanding that that's an important part of the story, and also that inequality is an important part of the story, and that there's a need for a greater public investment. But I think the important thing about a magazine, and I think your magazine completely exemplifies this. It's almost inherent in the libertarian world. The important thing about a magazine is to represent a pretty much of a broader range of views. If a magazine has a kind of sense of party line or doctrine, it sort of ceases to be a magazine. I think the American Prospect covers a pretty broad range there too.
Have you ever been a member of a labor union, and is the American Prospect a unionized shop?
Has the American Prospect, what was the?
Is the American Prospect a unionized shop? And
it is not a unionized shop.
And have you ever belonged to a labor union?
I don't know. Union battles at left-wing organizations are kind of, someone could write a book about that in itself.
Yeah,
there.
well, I always loved
with
the Village Voice union battles and such.
Village Voice union battles. I once worked with a bunch of women who were exiles from trying to unionize the feminist press and things like that. I don't think there's been ever been something like that here. I have.
Go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just inserting my own geographical bias. I was born and raised in Southern California, which until 15 years ago, when it changed pretty radically and interestingly, as your own Harold Meyerson has written over the years, has been historically one of the most anti-union towns for a long time because of the Los Angeles Times and other kind of regional characteristics. So I was sort of born and raised not having much to say about unions one way or the other. But as a practical concern, I've been involved in the sort of management of media organizations and newspapers over the years, and I've never just seen what possible good thing a union would do anywhere that I've worked before, just as a practical thing, whether I belonged to one or whether there was one, at a paper that I started in Prague or something like that. It didn't seem to be a fit for the world that we live in, but that's my own personal slant on things.
You don't think historically unions had something to do with the level of with basically the great American accomplishment, which was the creation of the mass middle class?
Oh, I'm talking about a personal kind of thing. No, of course, labor unions, especially ones that are allowed to sort of organize freely, have played a big role. Just like when you get down to the practical level of your personal life, I think I've never worked at a place where I thought to myself, humding, we need ourselves a union here, or the place would be better operated, right, and the employees would be better off if they were bargaining collectively. I've just never seen it. But then again, I've only worked in one warehouse in my life and not many factories, so maybe I would have a different point of view if I worked in a different industry.
Mm-hmm. It's also the historical role maybe in some ways is different from the present role, and certainly the relationship of a union for somebody somebody who's basically able to command some bargaining power as an individual, which you are with your profession, with your skills and your professional distinction, is different from the role of a union for somebody who can only get that bargaining power by working collectively.
Yeah, maybe. I've just spent my life without much bargaining power at all. But I've always assumed that if I ever get some, it'll be some that I have earned more than anything else. And
you're the boss now, right?
Well, I wasn't the boss a few
You're management,
years
man.
back. We're management. Hell yeah, we're management. Actually,
we're both management.
My sister-in-law is a big organizer for the California Nurses Association, so I know about...
Oh, man, you don't get more radical than that.
I know about ball-busting unions. They single-handedly, I think, or double-handedly croaked Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is sort of a little reported story, I think. But 3-4 years ago, when Schwarzenegger had a really aggressive posture towards the unions, and I think it was a tactical error on his part, even though I think public sector unions in California are odious in every sense of the word. But he went around and sponsored some ballot initiatives that were sort of pointlessly tweaking unions, and the California Nurses Association, among others, but chiefly them. They basically went to every single public speech and event that he went to for like 18 months or 2 years or something like that. He'd speak at a high school graduation in Santa Monica at a private school. You'd think it'd be a pretty safe place to go, and there'd be the CNA, torturing him in chants, and he'd go to an Angel game, and he'd get dogged by the CNA, which is a very aggressive union. And at some point, he lost that special election in a really big way, and he just basically kind of caved. In a way that you would probably like a lot more than I did. When he became a governor, I had some hopes that he would do some modest reinvention of the way that California was organized, which is sort of famously terrible. And he tried for a couple of weeks and on a lot of important kind of reforms, including to the prison system, which is something that I care about a lot. Ultimately,
which also has a very powerful, very conservative union.
A terrible union. For me, it's not a question of is a union conservative, liberal, or whatever. Right. It's more of is it a public sector union, and if so, where is my brick?
Right.
No, I mean, in a place like Los Angeles, where I lived until recently, public sector unionism is just it's a job protection racket and a way to guarantee really crappy, unbalanced budgets and bad delivery of services, and I don't see any purpose of it. Private sector unionism, I've got no problem with, although, as I said before, I've never been at a place where it made a whole lot of sense to me personally.
Right.
But let's talk about your fantastical plans for the American prospect.
My fantastical plans are to turn it into an anti-union outfit. My fantastical plans. I think we have a terrific. It's a terrific magazine already. We've got a lot of folks like Ezra Klein, who's been writing fantastic stuff about health policy and about the election and about economics, and Dana Goldstein is a staff writer and has been writing about education and so forth. Tara McKelvey has been writing about issues of torture and interrogation and things like that. Fantastic group of young writers here. We have a whole program of writing fellows. People come in for, in theory for a year or two. Some people, kind of burrow in, like Ezra, through that fellowship, and it's a kind of a great opportunity to get people started. And just, I just sort of want to. My vision is to produce the most interesting magazine imaginable. I mean, the challenge I think for both of us is how much. We've got a great magazine on the web, we've got a great magazine in print, and the challenge is how do you keep both of those going and attract your web readers and your print readers and make money and get interesting ideas out there. I mean, for me, the interesting thing for the American prospect is, assuming an Obama administration and a Democratic majority next year, to me what the American prospect is a magazine that kind of captures the point where politics and policy meet. It's not a political gossip magazine. It's not it's not really. We've got enough magazines covering the election horse race and what polls say what and who said what in this debate and between magazines and MSNBC and everything else. We've got a lot of coverage of that. We do some of that. But the real moment for a magazine like The Prospect to shine is when you're in that legislative moment next year and you're really capturing the ways in which politics really shapes what's possible in terms of policy, what's possible in terms of healthcare, what's possible in terms of dealing with climate change, things like that. What are the real institutional forces, and how do they move, and what determines how fundamental decisions about the future of our lives get made? And of course, the little of that is who determines. So there's a certain amount of kind of personality that we want to get into, but it's not necessarily personality for the sake of personality. Some crackpot congressman over there, but it's really kind of understanding where the levers of power are. So that's kind of what I want. That's kind of the story that I think our magazine will be telling over the next year or so.
Do me a favor and scare the hell out of all of my readers by telling them what you are hoping for in a kind of unified democratic Washington come January 21st, 2009. You mentioned in particular healthcare and climate change. What are some areas in which you're rubbing your hands together and saying, now fill in the blank is possible? What are those? What are those blanks? What do you see as a practical matter, and then as sort of like your own sort of wish list, or one or two things, let's say?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about, because I worked on Capitol Hill at the beginning of the Clinton administration. Everybody who sort of was through that experience thinks it's, the sequence is very important. What you do first is really important. And I mean, I think that might be a little less important here, but obviously, basically it's the same big three, right? It's healthcare, climate change, and figuring out how to get out of Iraq. I don't know why any of those, frankly, I don't know why any of those should scare your readers. And I don't want to scare your readers. I think your readers, let's say your reader runs a small business and wants to but can't provide health care for her employees. They should be very, very open to something that kind of reduces the cost overall, creates some systems in which people can actually buy insurance that they can't buy now, but fundamentally guarantees coverage, because when you guarantee coverage for everybody, it's cheaper for everybody rather than the kind of adverse selection that we have now, or under the kind of plans that Senator McCain would propose. So, I mean, I don't want to scare your readers. I think your readers should be. I think this will be as libertarian-friendly a Democratic era as there ever has been, because I think Democrats have learned a lot of lessons about how you can make systems work in ways that enhance freedom.
But wouldn't you agree also, though, that in this political campaign especially, I think in Obama's rhetoric and even Hillary Clinton's, or even especially Hillary Clinton's rhetoric on the campaign trail, it seems to me Democrats are running more in the economic left than they have been. In my judgment, and maybe I'm skewed, but Obama is running to the economic left of, let's say, Howard Dean or John Kerry, or certainly Clinton. I mean, Clinton was talking about the era of big government is over and etc. I'm not hearing noises like that. I'm hearing a lot of hostility to trade. I mean, even in Obama's big ballyhooed race speech, which I think was a great speech, and also in his Berlin speech to some degree, he's saying that we can all unify behind the idea that we're losing our job to the damn Indians. He didn't use that language, but that's basically the effect of what he's talking about. That is.
Well, he didn't use anything close to that language. That's not anything
no. I mean,
close
what he said was that black and white, Latino, whatever. The thing that we shouldn't be dividing ourselves, but the thing that we all share in common is job insecurity because of growth and jobs moving to China and India. He definitely said that, and that to me is worrying on a just an economic way. I believe, and I don't think it's an article of faith, that the free trade and exchange between nations is the greatest anti-poverty program ever invented, that and immigration. And so to see him sort of run against that is, to me, worrying. And I think beyond that, the sort of superstructures around the kind of the daily cost, maybe the American prospect, I don't know if it's a fair characterization, but the overall sort of democratic climate strikes to me as having a spring in its step in a certain way, and is not sort of looking for libertarian solutions on economic fronts in the way that you would see maybe Clinton looking at in the 90s as a result of trying to work with Newt Gingrich and whatnot. So I'm of the worry, let's say, and certainly readers of our magazine are in the worry that that talk is being dropped to some degree. And there's open talk of re-regulation in the air among people who are supposed to be serious. And I think that is as worrisome to me personally, and I think to readers as well, as anything with the idea of unified governance under anybody. Because certainly unified government under George Bush was a disaster, I think, in every way, shape, and form. And I just worry that it's also going to be a disaster under Barack Obama.
Right. Well, I think you're mixing up a couple different things. I mean, one, I think there is a uniform. There is a different mood about trade, which is not one that, which is, I don't think of it as an anti-trade attitude. I mean, I certainly come from a background, of strong support for NAFTA. Fundamentally agree with you that trade is the greatest anti-poverty program there is. However, there's an increasing acknowledgement with folks like Larry Summers and Alan Blinder kind of leading the way that there are profound consequences in the U.S. for some of the moves we've made in trade, and we can't pretend that those consequences don't exist, and that therefore greater attention to labor standards, environmental standards is important. Greater attention to the kind of social contract and the kind of supports that people need in order to function in the globalized economy, in an economy that's creating an enormous amount of Schumpeterian creative destruction, is an important public goal. And that leads people, I think, it leads people more in the direction of believing that there is actually a greater role for government now, greater role for government in healthcare, greater role for government in helping to provide that safety net, than people used to think in the 90s, when you sort of thought, well, if you just, education could solve all problems. I don't think that should be a threatening. I mean, that's a reality. I don't think that's a threatening thing. I don't think people are saying that. I don't think Larry Summers is saying that, or people are, Alan Blinder, economist at Princeton. I don't think people are like that are saying that because of Daily Kos, or because they're being pulled to the left by some Democratic Party dynamics. Barack Obama comes out of the very same, roughly centrist, pro-free trade faction of the party, but there are certain realities that he and others have acknowledged, and that frankly Mitt Romney acknowledged as well. So I don't, particularly in that period where he was talking about significant public investment when he was running to win the Michigan primary. So I mean, I think there are forces that politicians have to just acknowledge, because they're forces in the real world, not just political forces, that lead us to think about a bigger role for government. I mean, we had an article in the American Prospect a couple months ago by Bill Galston at Brookings, and Galston is a pure Clintonite, moderate guy, very much represented the kind of deal that you were talking about, basically saying, we just have to have a bigger role for government here, and we have to kind of accept that going forward. It's a terrific article. Government can be freedom enhancing.
Going back to one point that you made earlier about our readers and a healthcare reform that would allow more people to have healthcare for less money. I think it's less a fear of that, more a fear of promises that don't end up being true. There's an article I just glanced at today in the Wall Street Journal that talked about how Romney Care in Massachusetts has ended up being a hell of a lot more expensive, and people sort of flying to the state-provided insurance program, and it becoming way more expensive and sort of busting the budget and these kind of things. The devil is in the details on a lot of these kind of issues,
right.
and it's those devils that people are specifically concerned with. I wanted to talk a little bit about... I
think that's right. I will say the problems with some of the problems with the Massachusetts plan were quite predictable and were predicted, and not being willing to structure it in a way that would make make those work and put enough money up front actually winds up costing you more money down the road.
I want to talk a little bit about Obama. There was a column by your favorite columnist, Richard Cohen, in the Washington Post today, basically in which he said that he went around to all of his Obama-supporting friends and asked them one question, which was, name something that Obama has done that you think is sort of great or admirable, or a goal that he has accomplished. And he came back saying, well, they really couldn't say much. So at the risk of stealing Richard Cohen's ideas, which will be the first and last time that ever happens, you, assuming that you have some fondness for Obama, what has he done that you like?
Restored hope to the world. Anybody say that to Richard Cohen? No, I mean, seriously. I mean, obviously, it is a fact that Obama started running for president shortly after coming to the Senate. And accomplishments in the Senate, generally big accomplishments. I mean, he did an enormous amount on nuclear nonproliferation in the time that he was there. Big accomplishments in the Senate take, on average, 4 to 6 years to kind of nurture them to the point where you could say, this was an accomplishment. I mean, it was before my time, but when Bradley did tax reform, that was a 1982 through 1987 sequence of events. That's you lay the groundwork and then you really have an accomplishment. Nobody blasts anything through. For that matter, McCain's his one accomplishment, which I think both of us think is no accomplishment at all, is McCain-Feingold. That's another 7-year operation. So in terms of classic Senate thing that he can put his name on, probably not. I think there are significant accomplishments in criminal justice and in other issues, as a legislature, and frankly, putting together the campaign that he's put together is an enormous accomplishment. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a huge managerial accomplishment, which is just continues to be staggeringly impressive to me. And then integrating that with a kind of rejuvenated Democratic Party, again, I'll give you a chance to pump your magazine a little bit, but we'll have a good article in the forthcoming issue about some of that. But there was an article in Rolling Stone about it recently. Just an amazing organizational challenge, the equal of anything that Carly Fiorina has done, frankly, because the political stuff has to be so fast and is so improvisational, and you're not getting all the kind of market feedback instantaneously that you're getting in the private sector. That alone is an amazing accomplishment.
I agree. I would also point out that my good friend John McCain has, say what you will about him, but he pulled a few rabbits out of his hat this campaign, whether it was all luck, which I don't think it all was, but or whatever, is maybe a different question. But talk about Rasputin. How many times was he declared dead by friend and foe alike? And
right,
he comes
by me. Do you have any of those great clips where you declared him dead?
No, I never did.
Good for you.
I mean,
I think I only have one.
A practical necessity. I had to turn in the first.
You had a
draft.
book to sell, right?
I had to turn in my first draft of the book on July 15th of last year, and it was July 12th of last year that he fired, half of his campaign staff and went on a retreat to his Sedona ranch to see whether he really had his heart in this or not. So I I had to write a last chapter, or and an introduction with some qualifiers. But even then, I was lucky enough to guess. But I think it's also true that he is psychologically most comfortable when he's counted out, or when he's the underdog, or when he's behind. And I think that actually is, in a weird way, one of his 2 or 3 only kind of glimmers of opportunity in this election, which is shaping up to be a wipeout for Republicans. Largely a much deserved wipeout for the Republicans. I would not characterize it as any kind of deserved victory for the Democrats. But the Republicans had their chance, and they've really kind of eaten it. But in terms of what he's done, part of it is that when he's behind, when he thinks that everyone's counting him out, he is suddenly calm. It's a very psychological, comfortable place for him to be, and it's been like that his whole life. So if he's consistently 5 to 10 points down behind Obama in this race, I think that's perfect for him. Because one, any event can happen at any time that's going to shake up the calculation. If there's any kind of attack on U.S. soil, or just sort of conflagration abroad that changes the way people feel and think, I think that's going to accrue positively toward him in almost any circumstance, because people are going to want to go with perceived experience and sort of gravitas. But if he's just within striking distance, anything is possible. And, when people are writing his obituary, that's when he looks the most sort of pleasant and viable. Like, this great man has served our country so honorably over these years, and isn't it a shame? And, Chris Matthews famously said, this is the worst part of my job, having to watch a great man not win the Republican primary. And, you'd be getting that kind of stuff when Barack is waltzing to victory. I think McCain has some strength in campaigning, definitely, and in organization. Whether that has manifested so far in the general election campaign, I don't really think it has. I think he's run a pretty lousy campaign so far, and is coming off just kind of as a grumpy old man who's whining about the press coverage of his opponent, which is a pretty rich thing for the media's favorite Republican in the last quarter century to even think about doing.
I'll say, yeah. No, I mean, it's had this real herky-jerky quality, even right down to everybody made fun of the green background a few months ago, and it's sort of like, it wasn't just that it was the green background, it was like first they had the black background, then they went to the green background, then they go to the blue background. I mean, they couldn't settle on anything. I think you're right in that sense that McCain is obviously best when he's freest and he's not trying to execute as the front runner. No doubt about that. I think it's much harder for him as the candidate of his party. I've always, my view, my little theory about McCain was that he was actually always dreaming of running as an independent, and would have been fun, the McCain-Lieberman ticket, and they both would have said, we were rejected by the extremes in both our parties, and then they would have been able to kind of run free of any kind of structure. That's where he'd sort of be most comfortable. But his problem now is that he's the underdog, and he can sort of and he has the advantages of an underdog, but he's still the candidate of the institutional Republican Party, and there's just kind of like the boxes that he has to put himself in that role. So very often when you see the sort of the dumbest things he says, like when he talks about gay adoption or contraception or things that he actually doesn't care about, and if he had an opinion about them, it would be the typical opinions of a typical 72-year-old man, probably, which are not necessarily that extremist, but it's not even like he has an opinion about them. It's kind of, you see him racking his brain for, I know there's an official Republican position on this, and I just don't quite remember what it is. And then he kind of comes out with something like, oh yeah, marriage is always between a man and a woman, or something like that. That's okay. That's the official line. And so he's really, the idea that he's sort of free and out of the box, he's not out of the box. He's in the Republican nominee box. Now maybe he's a little more out of that box once he gets through the convention, and once he's kind of got a running mate who kind of validates him as legitimate. Maybe he has a little more freedom to just kind of say whatever the hell he wants. But right now, I don't think he's able to take advantage of the freedom that he potentially has. That has been kind of his saving his saving grace.
Well, he's got a real schizophrenic balancing act to deal with, and I think ultimately it will probably doom him unless something unforeseen happens in the next 100 days, which is that he won the Republican primary not because of Republicans, but because of non-Republicans, of independents, Democrats, people who are against the war, believe it or not, and and people who hate George W. Bush. They all voted for McCain, by 2-1 and 3-1 over, even Ron Paul, which is just shocking, I think. But so he needs those people, or enough of those people, who are, are not immediately cottoning on to Barack Obama so far. He wants those independents, they're sort of stand-ins in the media who still have a residual fondness for him, although that's starting to erode. He needs those people to still come out and vote for him if he has any shot. And at the same time, he needs to shore up a Republican base that is just restive as all get out. I mean, I covered the Ralph Nader campaign in 2000. I was one of the only reporters who was actually following him around everywhere for a site way to the left of the American Prospect called workingforchange.com, which I think was
wow, man.
Oh, yeah.
A sordid background.
Go look up the American Prospect files on Matt Welch. I almost got a job there. Anyways.
All right. Yeah, we have really good files here, Just.
I'm sure you do. No, the Democrats in 2000, specifically sort of old progressive lefty Democrats and what was then called the Seattle Coalition, which hopefully has been successfully quarantined or something. But no, there was a lot of people who were just sort of fed up with Clintonism, with what they saw as his grand sellout. The only thing that kept any of those people anywhere near Clinton was the impeachment, actually. That rallied a lot of people to his corner that had long given up on him. And the closeness of the election. Nader was polling 5% all the way up till Election Day, and he ended up getting 2.7 or something along those lines. But the kind of overall sense of dispiritedness and the feeling like, we deserve to lose. I'm hearing a lot of the same things in Washington, at least, among Republicans in 2008 that I heard among dyed-in-the-wool Democrats in 2000, and it'll be interesting to see where those votes go, whether they just sit on their hands. I know quite a lot of people. There's an actual thing called Obamacons, or libertarians for Obama. Sure. Some will go that way. Some will vote for Bob Barr. I think Barr will definitely be the number 3 candidate in this election, which will be the first time since 1988 that the Libertarian Party has come in 3rd place, I think. But it's interesting to watch. It's clearly, there's nothing that creates and coheres party unity better than being out of power for a good long time. Right. So I always thought that this talk of like an irreconcilable split between Hillary supporters and Obama supporters was just foolishness. People are going to forget that, and they're going to rally around the cause of like, hey, we can get the White House here.
Oh, sure. And that there aren't profoundly significant underlying differences other than did you support Hillary or Obama. I mean, they're not. It's not like that break was that representative of another huge breach, as there would be if there had been, a kind of breach split around labor, or one was a pro-life candidate, or something like that. You have potentially a breach, but there really was very little. The amount that you wound up magnifying the distinction on the healthcare mandate issue, on which in the end I think the actual result will be exactly the same, whichever one of them would have been, even whether Hillary Clinton had been president or Barack Obama, it would have been insignificant. The amount of weight that was placed on those subtle differences was really hilarious. No, I think that's right. It's an interesting question how much of the dissatisfaction with McCain is, or how much of the, I know what you're talking about 2000 and that Nader era, and there was this kind of mood among a lot of people to my left that was kind of like, it doesn't matter. Clinton betrayed us. We had hopes. We got screwed. Forget it. Who really cares anymore? I wonder if the attitude about McCain is similar to that about Bush, or if it seems a little more deeply fraught. Like Bush's failure is much more profound for conservatives as well as for run-of-the-mill Republicans and sort of suburban Republicans, Bush's failure is much more profound and active than was Clinton's perceived failure in 2000.
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, a lot of people had high hopes that once Clinton was a lame duck, he'd finally do the things that we know his heart wanted to do and all this kind of stuff. Right. And they were largely disappointed on that as well. And there's a whole critique of Al Gore of having like a totally lousy environmental policy compared to the wish list that even he had elucidated in his various books and speeches over the years. So I think there was a pretty restive thing. The McCain and the sort of Republican coalition falling apart, I think these things overlap. McCain has made a lot of enemies over the years, very personally. He tends to hyper-personalize all politics. So not only are you wrong, not only do you disagree with me about the war, but you are putting politics over American security, and you're rooting for us to lose, which is what he said about Obama last week, which I think is just a non-starter politically, but I mean, I could be wrong. But he does that on every other thing too. He did the same thing with tobacco. He supported a $1.10 tax on every pack of cigarettes 10 years ago, and then today, and when he did so, he was shot down by Republicans, and he said to Republicans, I guess, they care more about big tobacco than they do about the children. And, this time around, McCain is like, you know what, we don't need any more taxes on cigarettes. There's no clear link between putting a tax on cigarettes and, stopping child smoking. All that stuff is malleable to him, but the thing that remains constant is this sort of moral high horse that he gets on, where his opponents are not just wrong, but they're letting their ambition get in the way of the honor of America. And so whoever has rubbed up against him in those wars has, he's created an enemy there, and there are quite a few in the Republican coalition, especially, grassroots anti-abortion groups who really went up against McCain-Feingold, and just any number of people. So that overlaps with this sort of general sense of malaise of that. What does the Republican Party even stand for anymore? Certainly among fiscal conservatives and libertarians who had sort of broadly more sympathetic to Republicans, certainly than they were to Democrats, there's no real evidence, with the occasional exception of minor stuff that's happening in the Department of Transportation, of that. This is any kind of fiscal conservative. I mean, George Bush has grown the government faster than any president since Lyndon Johnson, and that's non-defense spending we're talking about too. So what is it that he's done that's conservative that a libertarian or a fiscal conservative would like? Well, the list ain't long. And I think it's often mischaracterized on the left. In any book written by someone named Naomi, you can guarantee that it's like the neocon economic policies that have privatized America, and libertarians are over here saying, if that happened, I wish I'd known about it, because we certainly haven't seen it. We've seen new entitlement programs and expansions of various government agencies and all this kind of stuff. So
there are neocon programs. I mean, if you draw the distinction, I think people who do it more subtly understand there's a neocon program, which is obviously very different from the libertarian program.
It's an explicit assault, and always has been, on the libertarian program. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why libertarians don't appreciate John McCain necessarily, is that this sort of neoconservatism, or better stated, national greatness conservatism, the sort of David Brooks, Bill Kristol, we need great causes and to go after the malefactors of great wealth and all this kind of stuff. It came about as an attack on Goldwater republicanism, on Gingrich. What they said was Gingrich republicanism. They said you can't build a lasting governing coalition on an anti-government platform. We need to be in favor of government. Those are not the kind of words that make a libertarian's heart swell with happiness. They were in the wilderness. You talked earlier about McCain maybe wanting to be sort of a Teddy Roosevelt, running on an independent bull moose, Joe Lieberman type of ticket. If you take a snapshot of like May and June of 2001, that's totally true. I mean, people were talking about whatever happened to the neoconservatives back then. They were in the wilderness. They were cooperating with Democrats on any number of programs and ideas, and there was open talk of them either joining the Democrats or starting their own kind of, Marshall Whitman-tastic type of organization. But then, as we all know, September 11th changed everything, and a lot of basically Bush's foreign policy went from being what he campaigned on, which was a humble foreign policy, to what John McCain had campaigned on, which was preemptive war. It's still bizarre to me that I think too many people in the public, though not readers of your magazine and not readers of mine, aren't aware that McCain ran as a neocon in '99 and 2000, and that was a central part of his sort of appeal and sort of animating desires.
Right. But it creates an interesting paradox, because on the one hand he has his great strength, which is that he can be perceptually distinct from Bush. I mean, he has greater ability, as you said. He won the nomination on the votes of people who were opposed to the Iraq War, opposed to Bush administration policies, who were in fact Democrats and independents and so forth. And yet his political arc is actually one where he winds up looking, especially on foreign policy, he's wound up looking more like Bush than because Bush moved over to where he was on foreign policy. They're actually closer than they need to be, and even on some of the other issues, because he has so little to show for. I mean, he could, in theory, be more more appealing to people who are fiscally conservative, but he's got nothing there. I mean, he's just got a bunch of random tax cuts, and then okay, he'll do something about earmarks. Well, that's not any. Where is the Gingrich? We're going to shut down a Department of Government.
Right. And I mean, ultimately,
sort of gives you some bona fides. Go for it.
He's got a great record against being anti-earmarks, and he's done great work on stuff like rooting out corruption in the Boeing deal and these kind of things. He's done some pretty great work on these accounts, but
which was a nice deal, of course, for his own lobbyist friends who were on the other side of the Boeing deal.
You can bet that his own lobbyist friends are always going to work out okay. No, in terms of is that in itself going to limit the size of government or restrain its growth in any way when you are, increasing the size of the standing military by 150,000 troops, when you're getting into a much more aggressive posture than Bush towards China, towards Russia, towards Iran, towards any number of places. There is this thing called the military that we spend money on too, and there's no way that I can see in a McCain presidency where that wouldn't just continue to increase and dwarf any potential cut that he might imagine. And even on stuff like tax
cuts. It's not even a tough question. No. Earmarks have nothing to do with anything. I mean, you could eliminate all the earmarks and not save a dollar, because all they are is streams of existing funding that are kind of tagged with, and it's, in most cases it isn't appropriate for Congress to tag those streams of money, but the streams of money don't go away just because you take the earmarks out.
Right. I mean, I think there would be actual value in sort of shaming the culture that thinks that you can just slap federal money on anything willy-nilly for narrow political concerns, or just stuff that is just not in the nation's interests. It's a freaking little research program at a state college somewhere, or a museum that just doesn't need my federal tax dollars to go to. I would appreciate the culture changing in that regard.
Right. It's also the bridge to nowhere, and I guess it was Don Young who was more responsible for the bridge to nowhere, but Ted Stevens, I think, was just indicted today. So, kind of, when the ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee is indicted, something's happening.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the fatigue of the Republican coalition comes from stuff like that. I mean, we've forgotten about it now just because we've all moved on, but with the whole kind of K Street project and the Abramoff scandal, there just sort of seemed to be the overall whiff of a tired corruption in D.C. I don't know if it, at the end of the day, was any more than the typical corruption that happens constantly in the federal government, or with whatever party, but there just didn't seem to be any, what is it that you're doing that makes it conservative? And I think also that there was a moment of overreach. There's an argument to be made, I think, that the day that the Republican coalition sort of went too far was Terry Schiavo. It just looked gross. I mean, these were people who in the 90s were talking about, oh, we can't do fill in the blank because it's a huge, big government thing. Now they're legislating to intervene on behalf of a single person. It was just kind of disgusting to look at. And I think Americans, thank God, or whatever, Buddha, are at some point, there is in our DNA a feeling like the government shouldn't be doing everything. Even in an era which I think we're in, or an election result that I think that we'll see, where there is more of a feeling that the government needs to do more, which I disagree with, still that has a limitation. It goes up against the American character. And when there's overreach from either direction, left, right, whatever, left, right, or Aaron Huffington, then I think there's going to be an instinctual backlash against that. And I ultimately think that might be a real limiting factor on the reign of President Obama. I mean, I just don't see. I have wanted to be enthusiastic about him at various points, especially hearing parts of his original sort of foreign policy critique, which is the issue that I probably care about the most. But ultimately, I haven't really seen what is it that he would be changing. Again, how is he different than stock Democratic politician concretely? And that's an actual question that I'm asking you. I mean, I just don't know what that is. And coupled with a resurgent Democratic majority, I just sort of see the same kind of interest groups getting funded, and and ongoing ridiculous deficits and other things that I don't particularly enjoy.
Well, I'll say one thing. One thing about Senator Obama is he is not the creation of any interest group. I mean, the nice thing about partly that's not because he's a better person. It's because of the role that he played. And when you win in that way, you were not put in that position by the NEA or by NARAL or by any of the basic constituent groups of the Democratic Party, which in fact are weaker anyway as the overall Democratic Party has grown stronger. So there's an opportunity to sort of have a different relationship with the constituent groups, which is a valuable way to exercise power and independence. And two, I think that that Obama, and I think, for people of roughly, I'm younger than Obama, as I'm always, have to point out, because you
keep
can't
telling
be
yourself
president. But for as long as I am, I think that sort of in our generation, we've internalized and recognized some of the overstretch that brought down liberalism before. I mean, we have a lot of curiosity about. We're all great students of conservatism. I wrote a piece about this the other day. I mean, we are immersed in this. In some way, it's shameful how much more we read about, the latest book about the conservative revolution, or the latest Welch book about McCain or whatever. We're deeply invested in how did this political philosophy succeed. And I think those of us who are kind of grew up in that Reagan era, we get, and Obama certainly gets, the elements of that period that are in fact deeply ingrained in the American spirit: the distrust of government, the sense of desire for equality of opportunity and not equality of result. I mean, there's a sense of getting that the liberals of the late 60s and 70s where it was sort of born in their blood that government had greater access to information and could design things, and they had to be national programs and couldn't involve states. That there are things that he gets that will result in a very different kind of liberal program than even what you had potentially under Clinton, even though most of it never really was never really manifest. So that's, in a sense, that's why I do sort of say that. I mean, I think you should terrify your readers, because I think you'll get more readers if you terrify readers, and go for it. And we'll try to terrify we're a little worried. It'll be tough to not have as much to terrify our readers about, but we'll do some attacks on you libertarians or something like that. I think you should terrify your readers, but you know what? I actually don't think libertarians should be. I mean, come back to this point. I don't think libertarians should be worried. I think it's I think it'll be a golden age of freedom in America.
I certainly hope you're right. In fact, we're in our November issue, our election issue, that we're going to start working on here in a bit. We're having a round-robin forum of sort of libertarian-ish commentators discussing the prospects of what Obama hopes, fears, whatever, and it's not it's not a hate fest so far. There's a surprising number of people who are sort of more positively inclined toward him than I certainly would have expected. And I think part of it too is it's interesting. There's a weird mirror between Obama's campaign in 2008 and McCain's in 2000. They are both somewhat blank slates, those two campaigns, onto which people will project their most fervent hopes, mostly, more than fears, although you get a little bit of fears as well. But people just sort of give Obama the benefit of the doubt. And by people, in this case, I mean, even a lot of libertarians and conservatives of, oh, well, he might be talking bollocks about trade or whatever, but he was in the University of Chicago and he understands about markets, and maybe he said a thing or two about school vouchers and whatever. They will just sort of he might have made a couple of noises in this direction, so I think I trust him on that count. It's something that you still hear to some degree about McCain, though not as much this time around, but I'm sure that you've heard maybe within your own offices of people who are still kind of positively inclined towards him out of muscle memory from 2000, who will say stuff like, oh, well, yeah, I disagree with McCain on just about everything, but he's more likely, just because I kind of like him, to do a Nixon in China type of thing with Iraq.
Right.
You hear that constantly.
That's right.
And to me, it's an incredible misreading of his foreign policy and everything that he has said and done for the last 12 years or so. But it's also an interesting exercise in this sort of positive projection. If you just think that a guy is decent and you're sort of positively inclined towards him, you are going to give every little hint in that direction. That's proof enough as far as you're concerned. You kind of leave your skepticism at the door. I think a lot of people are doing that with Obama right now in a way that they did with McCain in 2000, and in a way that some people still do with McCain. And that's just a weird place to be in, where you have both politicians are, to an alarming degree, sort of objectively likable, especially by the media, and it makes me, of course, terribly uncomfortable.
I know. Yeah, like bring back our, Nixon versus, I don't know, Tsongas or something like that.
Versus McGovern.
Yeah, well, I like McGovern's an inherently likable guy to me. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, McCain in 2000 was a much briefer experience. I mean, we've got a lot more out there about Obama, a whole lot more, and a whole lot more people who've kind of made that judgment at this point than that, brief, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Michigan phenomenon of McCain in 2000. But of course that's right, and of course it's also not wrong, not invalid. I mean, I've always argued that you have to, even in the times we live in, where I do know a hell of a lot about what our nation's problems are, you're still electing a president to deal with the issue you don't know about as much as the issue that you do know about, and a lot of that does have to do with really just perception of character, and the role somebody plays on an issue could sort of be something that, even if you disagree with them, tells you something about their character. Take for example McCain. I mean, McCain's position on campaign finance reform, which you disagree with, and I at this point think is mostly disagree with, but nonetheless it kind of marked out a certain role that he was willing to play, of just like stepping away from the party and getting on a different track. That even if you disagreed with it on substance, it said something interesting and actually appealing about him.
Right.
Now he doesn't give it. Now he doesn't care about it anymore. So what do it's one more instance where he's the combination of self-righteous and opportunistic is quite distasteful. But that it's how it is. People can use an issue even if your positions don't match, it still reflects well on their character.
We should probably get going here, Mark.
We should get going. Let's wrap this up. I don't want the last word. I don't want the last word, but if I have to have it, I will.
I want to just put us both on the record of predicting what happens in November, so that we can all look back and laugh and cry together. So give me a percentage and an electoral college like rough vote, since neither I nor you know what the total number of electoral college votes are at this point.
Yeah, you mean the total?
The
total of electoral college votes? I think I know that. 535, right? 537?
538.
537. 538 with because there's 3 from the district. Okay, but I haven't really done an electoral. I think I've been saying all week as Obama's kind of floated around between. I guess he was actually behind in one poll, 4 points, 9 points in another poll. I think 8 points is the ceiling for Obama. So if it's not like people who think, oh, he should be ahead by 15, he should be ahead by whatever in some imaginary world. I think that's kind of crazy. So I'll just say 7 points in the popular vote, and that probably gives you a pretty solid, probably pretty solid 300 electoral votes.
Mm-hmm. I surprisingly
super calculating powers right now.
I surprisingly agree with you. My latest idea is 51 to 45 to 3 for Bob Barr, which is obviously a little bit optimistic.
Big. We should have talked about Bob Barr a little more. You guys had a very good article by Dave Weigel about the Libertarian Convention and about Barr.
We got a big. We've got a Q&A coming out with him in the November issue, which is really interesting to read. Barr is, he's an interesting character, and I think probably the best that you can say, or one of the best things you can say, is better late than never on quite a few issues. But he seems to have been scared straight after the Patriot Act and after sort of the Bush expansion of executive power, and that's led him into some places that you would not have predicted in the mid-'90s, certainly.
Right.
That's
certainly true.
That's my.
Well, I have to say my basic view of the world is I've always felt I don't identify as a libertarian. I've got a little bit of a libertarian streak, but I don't fundamentally identify that way. But I've always felt like the legitimate third party in the United States actually should be the Libertarian Party. It's a kind of it's a belief that a lot of people identify with, and isn't really well reflected in either party. And why not?
Well, I appreciate the sentiments. Not even being a member myself. 3%
for Barr. It's more legitimate reflection than Nader's 3.7%. So
I think that it would be. With that, we should wrap up.
All right.
Mark, thank you very much.
Go run your magazine, and I'll go run mine.
Super, and hopefully we'll see you again here on Blogging Heads TV. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, very good, Mark.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.